Welcome to Unsupervised Thinking, a podcast about neuroscience, artificial intelligence, and science more broadly. We're a group of PhD students studying computational neuroscience. I'm Grace.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Connor.
And the topic for this episode is brain-computer interface, and specifically brain-computer interface interfacing with the motor system.
Okay, so to spell it out a little bit slowly before we get into detail, a brain-machine interface or brain-computer interface, what those things will usually refer to is something where the brain, or more generally perhaps the nervous system, which includes the nerves in the spinal cord, for example, is interfacing directly with something like a computer or a machine. The way that the body normally works in terms of how the brain controls behavior, right, is that, roughly speaking, we don't really know the details, but the brain has neurons in it. And when we want to, say, move part of our body, like our arm or our vocal cords when we're trying to speak, there is neural activity in some brain areas that are involved in that particular task. And we think in neuroscience that in some way that neural activity affects, in the end, ultimately muscles via signals that travel through the spinal cord. And so the idea in brain-machine or brain-computer interfacing is to record those signals either externally on the scalp in the case of some non-invasive methods that we might talk about, or internally by actually trying to directly record the activity of neurons in the brain, and to use the signals that you record in order to control, for example, a cursor on a screen, or in the case of some clinical scenario where you want to help, for example, a patient who has lost control of their arm or maybe has lost their whole arm or another limb, you can use those neural signals to try to control in some useful way a prosthetic limb, for example. And so those are the kinds of situations that people are going to talk about in brain-machine interfacing and brain-computer interfacing.
So, generally the idea would be to help people potentially who are paralyzed or immobilized in some way recover some sense of mobility. For example, by having a person be able to control their wheelchair automatically through their thoughts if they can't move any parts of their body. And there's kind of, just to be clear, a whole, at a very high level, there's, kind of alternatives to this, right? So you could imagine that you're not going to actually interface with the brain. You could just interface with muscles, and maybe you use kind of residual muscles that a mostly paralyzed person has in their forehead, or you'll use eye tracking software, and depending on where the person looks, it'll control something.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a thought that wouldn't it be cool if you could give these people a lot of mobility back by tapping into their brain directly and letting them control something that's maybe more complicated than you could ever imagine them controlling with just eye tracking or something like that.
Just to be clear, a basic BCI setup kind of has three different parts. One would be the sensors that you use to get information about neurons, and that can be something like EEG on the scalp. And then there's going to be some sort of decoder or algorithm or something that's done by a computer that turns those signals into a command for the third part, which would be some sort of output, some sort of actuator like a robotic arm or a cursor on a screen. And so really you can have choices at each step about what different sensor you want, what kind of algorithm you want to use, and what kind of output you want. And so you can have these sensors that are non-invasive, and the benefit of that is that surgery isn't required and they're easy to use and anyone can use them. But they have limitations in signal. You can also have something that is invasive, meaning that you require surgery to use it, and generally the skull is opened, and you can use something like ECOG, which is basically an EEG that is touching the brain directly so that it has a better signal. Or you can use individual electrodes that go into the brain and try to pick up signals from individual cells or from something called a local field potential, which is thought to be kind of the summed input to a group of cells. And so you can use any of those options or anything else you can come up with as a means of sensing neural activity that you then want to kind of decode and understand so that it can control your output device.
Generally, given the current technology, everything that people are doing with brain-computer interface, brain-machine interface, whatever, it's all going to be for clinical purposes.
And there's not even that many examples of true invasive BCI for clinical purposes even. It's still in the very early stages.
Interfacing with the brain invasively is sufficiently burdensome to people that you wouldn't go through this, given the current technology, unless you had some serious clinical ailment that you wanted to partially remedy.
And exactly what you would do for a patient would depend on what their exact issue is. So if you have someone who, say, had an arm amputated, but they still have residual nerve endings in the remaining part of their arm that's left, maybe you just tap directly into those and use signals from those to control some sort of prosthetic arm rather than having to go into the brain. But for people who are completely paralyzed due to stroke or paralysis from the neck down or something like that, then usually the only option left is something that actually gets signal directly from the brain.
And just as one semantic point, right, there's a peripheral nervous system prosthesis is in some sense still a brain-computer interface, right? I mean, the brain is kind of ambiguous whether we mean the peripheral nervous system or not. That's kind of always something that's... But I mean, so the brain itself, right, is like the central nervous system, and so generally when people say brain-computer interface, they're referring to either non-invasive or more commonly, I would think, invasive recordings from the central nervous system, from like the cortex, basically. But there also are non-invasive brain-computer interfaces, something like an EEG, which is electrodes that are placed on the surface of the scalp, kind of attached with glue. And you can record kind of very noisy... To neuroscientists, these are low-quality signals that have been kind of filtered through the skull. And it doesn't seem likely to most neuroscientists that there will be very much utility for kind of high-resolution brain-computer interfaces. That is to say, the quality of these signals is sufficiently poor that it will be difficult to decode reliably any interesting signals rapidly enough to use them to control a robotic arm or something like this. So that's kind of not expected. And a whole another category of things that you could view as a component of this or for other purposes are sensory prostheses or sensory brain-computer interfaces. And we're not really focusing on that today, but I mean, for context, you might be able to replace the eye with a sensor that you would then wire directly into the brain and write in signals that replace the signals that the eye would natively receive. Or similarly, in the context of some motor brain-computer interfaces, maybe a person wants to control a robotic arm with their brain, but then you could kind of write in some signals that are supposed to be like a crude sensory impression. So like if they don't have a real hand and they're using this robotic hand, if the robotic hand touches something, they could get some signals to their brain to indicate what kind of things they're touching or the texture of those things.
And relatedly, you could have inputs from, again, say, a robotic arm that would try to mimic our proprioceptive abilities. So, when you hold your arm out, even if you close your eyes, you still have a sense of where your arm is relative to the rest of your body or relative to the objects around you. And so some people think it's important to have, in constructing good brain-machine interfaces for controlling prosthetic limbs and such, to have some kind of signals coming back from the prosthetic limb into areas of the brain that maybe we think are related to proprioception, so that you have some sense of where the artificial limb is.
So basically, brain-computer interfaces can go in either direction, from the brain to a computer to an output, or from the world through a computer into the brain. But the vast majority of research currently is on the motor output form of the brain-computer interface. And people are kind of just getting interested in really figuring out something like sensory feedback for these kind of prosthetic limbs and that sort of thing.
With the notable exception of the Cochlear Implant, right, which technically is a brain-computer interface and often gets overlooked in that category.
Yeah.
But the Cochlear Implant is a small number of electrodes that are put into the neural tissue that's within your ear and allows people who have problems with the sensory part of their ear to have the sort of nerve that goes from your ear to your brain stimulated directly and thereby kind of hear some crude signals, auditory signals that their brain learns to make sense of. Again, we're not really focusing on that here, though.
So the issue of how to collect the neural data and then what to do with it, what to use as an actuator in the world, those are difficult issues because there's a lot of constraints. You want a device, if you're going to have a patient be using it 24/7, you want a device that is lightweight and not really obvious to anyone. You don't want people to kind of have social stigma for using these devices. You need something that ideally has very long battery life and all of these kinds of things. And then for a prosthetic arm, you would need an arm that can move in many degrees of freedom and can kind of have natural behavior as much as possible and these kinds of things. And those are all very challenging problems, but those tend to fall on the engineering side of problems associated with brain-computer interface. Whereas neuroscientists, I think the most interesting part of this whole process is that middle part, the figuring out what information you can get from the neurons and how you can turn neural signals into commands to an output. And so we're going to be talking about ways that is being approached and kind of the issues surrounding that part of this process.
So kind of we're taking it for granted that you've acquired some neural signals, and we'll kind of mostly put aside EEG type settings and focus on invasive cortical electrodes, right, recordings. So something like ECOG or an array, like something like a Utah array, which has approximately 100 electrodes that penetrate into the brain and pick up from electrical activity from a small number of neurons. So you have something like this. You're recording from some neurons. Let's assume you've done all of the pre-processing, and you have something like a recording from between 10 and maybe 100 or 200 neurons, 200 individual neurons. And they're from the right brain areas, whatever that means. So people are trying to figure out what the brain areas that are optimal to record from this, but some parts of your cortex that are related to motor control.
And the reason that we'll be talking mostly about this form of collecting the neural signal is that is what's used most in current laboratory research with animals, and it's used because it's considered the best signal that you can acquire in terms of getting a lot of information and a lot of kind of cleaner and reliable information, things that are something like EEG that's coming through the skull and being recorded from the scalp is just considered a little too noisy and maybe not reliable enough to be used for the kind of high-dimensional control you would want for a motor prosthetic. It can be used for simpler things, like if you just want to indicate yes or no, maybe an EEG signal is sufficient to do that. But if you want to be able to kind of extract a lot of information simultaneously, it's pretty much
quickly
assumed,
in time.
Yeah, and quickly. It's pretty much assumed that you're going to need to be getting the information directly from neurons themselves. So it may seem somewhat straightforward, maybe, if you think, oh, okay, well, I can record from cells in motor cortex. I can, go to the area of the brain that represents the arm, and I can record from cells there. And now I have a robotic arm, and I'll just send the signals, to the robotic arm. But it's actually kind of being very generous to the field of neuroscience to assume that we can make sense of what those neural signals are. It's not actually known precisely what cells in motor cortex are representing. Even if we know, okay, we think this area is controlling the arm, the exact way in which that control signal is encoded is not known. And so it's not so simple to just kind of plop electrodes in there and pick up the signal and have a clear idea of what the intention of the person is in terms of what they want to do with their arm. And so that's kind of the heart of the problem in getting these devices to work.
So there are very naive things you could do, right? Like you could just basically do the simplest statistics that you could imagine on your set of cells and try to do those and try to use that basic things like linear regression or whatever to do decoding. But this is kind of underusing the power of the available.
Sure, and to be clear, that would be once you have some recordings from the animal while they're moving their arm, and you could see what the correlations between activity of certain neurons is with different movements, and then do some simple relationship to try to predict what they'd want to do the next time those neurons are active.
Yeah.
So there's a variety of interesting issues there, right? So one thing is Grace said, that we're not at the stage in neuroscience where we can go into, say, motor cortex and record the activity of like 100-ish neurons and predict with any kind of accuracy what it is that someone is trying to do with their body. So one thing there is that we don't know, like you said, the way in which a desire or a motor intention is encoded, the way that information is represented in some part of the brain. We don't know that. And so an issue in brain-machine interfacing is, do you want to try to learn from some kind of bottom-up type of way what the encoding is, and then use that knowledge to read someone's mind and then make a prosthetic limb do what you are inferring they want to do? This is kind of a fuzzy thing, but you can also imagine that you just put some recording device in, and in some kind of more computer learning way, where you let a computer algorithm adapt and learn somehow in some statistical way that has to be specified what the person wants to do. This kind of relates to things, about what it would mean to understand the neural code if we were able to build really good, say, brain-machine interfaces where we could record a bunch of neural activity, put it through some algorithm, and then have it wonderfully control with great accuracy a complicated device like a naturalistic prosthetic limb. We might still not say that we understand the way that the information is being represented in the brain, even though we can actually effectively read that information in a very useful way, for example.
And then another sort of complementary part of that is, so, option one, you observe the animal, let's say, actually moving his arm and just look for relationships between the neural activity and that movement. Option two, you kind of plug in the thing. You don't use this kind of supervised setting, and you just kind of let your algorithm learn things. Option three, right, is basically you plug the array in and kind of fix some rule whereby the animal could control some effector, the robotic arm or cursor or whatever. And you kind of let them learn how to do it.
So the idea in the third option is that it's something which would be called closed loop, in the sense that you control the device and you also can see how successfully you're controlling that. You can compare your intended movement with the actual movement on the screen or whatever, and that should provide some sort of learning signal. And because humans have a tendency to learn things, you might be able to increase performance of this just by the fact that your neural activity is changing in an effort to be able to successfully control the device.
Yeah, that doesn't have to be possible, right? Like, it might be that it might be that for an adult, the way that neural activity in the brain looks when you are, say, reaching out your right arm is totally fixed, and there's no plasticity. Things can't change much in the brain, such that if you try to decode by reading the activity of neurons with an electrode array in motor cortex, if you try to predict the movement that someone is trying to make with their, say, missing or paralyzed right arm, there might just be one way to do that. And it might be that if you don't know the perfect way to decode that information at the beginning, and you leave your decoder unaltered, the person will never be able to learn how to move, say, the prosthetic limb that they're trying to move. So that's already a kind of a finding, a not unexpected finding, which I guess, I don't know if that's not really a finding of BMI necessarily, and we knew this from other contexts, but it is the case that there's a lot of plasticity in the brain, and so it's actually expected that, at least to some extent, if you make you create a fixed mapping from recorded neural activity to the movement of a prosthetic limb or a cursor, it's expected that even if that mapping at the beginning is not very good, the person will be able to learn to control the device more accurately.
And so I think this is in the BMI field, the first person to show this, I believe, was Fetz at University of Washington, and this is considered like the notion that you could have volitional control over neural activity in motor cortex is considered kind of the cornerstone.
By using feedback, right? You need to have feedback.
So in this case, it was just that you could use volitional control to control single neurons or small numbers of neurons, and then use that for a prosthetic purpose.
And was that a reward thing or something that they would? I know people do these things with like rats and stuff, right? Where you can give the rat, you can record a neuron, and you can do things like very simple things like give the rat a reward every time the neuron fires more than a certain amount. And by doing that kind of thing, you can actually make neurons fire more. So that kind of already demonstrates in a very simple way the principle that things that happen to you in the world, like rewards, which, in the example of controlling a limb would be, I controlled the limb successfully in the way I wanted to, can actually change what neurons do in your brain by some processes that we don't really understand.
So while it's not obvious that you could do this in a specific brain area like motor cortex, it should be pretty kind of obvious that you can learn to do new motor things somewhere in your brain. Kind of a priori you don't know where in the brain that's going to be, but somewhere in the brain you could presumably learn. So, kind of at a very naive level, you can sort of imagine like playing a video game and learning how to use a video game controller to control a character on a screen or something like this. And the fact that you can do that you can kind of map movements of your fingers to the movements of a character on a screen, like you should be able to do, somewhere in your brain, you're able to learn, even as an adult, though potentially less well, arbitrary mappings between movements of a certain sort or intentions of a certain sort and control of something abstract that isn't directly related to the way your body works. So, anyone who's played video games, that should be somewhat intuitive, that somewhere in the brain that's possible.
And people talk about this just in, simple tool use, the notion that if you use a tool a lot, you kind of start to view it as an extension of your own body, and you have good predictive ability over what will happen to that tool when you do certain things, and you expect certain feedback and all of that.
So those things, right, it's kind of high-level clear. Turns out there's some ability for recording from kind of motor cortical areas to do this kind of thing, and you can express some of that intentionality, and you can do some of that kind of learning in those brain regions.
So it's a happy finding that the neurons are kind of so willing to adapt to this decoder that's kind of listening in on their activity and controlling something. But I guess it also is somewhat complicated because you can get a decoder that you've designed and maybe it works really well, and then the next day the animal uses it, it doesn't work that much because the neurons are changing for a variety of reasons. So there's kind of a question of how you deal with neurons changing their behavior as well as your attempts to make your decoder perform as best as possible, and what can happen when these two things interact.
So in thinking about it that way, there could be a few extremes, which I guess they talk about a bit in that perspective written by Shinoy and Carmina, where one would be, I don't know if they state it this way explicitly, but one extreme would be something we've already mentioned: record a bunch of neurons, define some maybe arbitrary mapping between what the neurons are doing and what the device does, and then fix that, let the person or the animal try repeatedly to do certain things with the device and see if they can learn, which in this case has to mean, because the decoder is fixed, it has to mean that their neural activity will change such that some neural activity, when mapped through this decoder that you've arbitrarily defined, results in desired movements. And then at the other extreme would be to try to build a decoder at the beginning, which I guess we mentioned this also at the very beginning, where, for example, have a monkey doing arm movements, and suppose we're trying to build a prosthetic arm, try to record activity while the monkey does actual arm movements, and then figure out the mapping between the neural activity and the arm movement.
So, the second option we basically call a biomimetic decoder, where the decoder is imitating or mimicking what the native system biologically would do. A third option, right, is for the decoder to do most of the learning. So you the assumption that goes into this kind of in a very hand-wavy sense is that the person or animal doesn't learn, that their neurons don't change. And you just put all of the work on the decoder to update itself based on some signals, based on some error or something like this, and try to get the decoder to do as well as possible given those fixed signals as more data comes in and you're able to learn more. So those are kind of some of the extremes. And that paper, I think, kind of their main message is maybe there's some productive synergy you can get out of playing with a couple of these things in conjunction, right? So instead of treating just these extreme cases, which are the easiest to do research on, right? It's easier to fix the decoder and see how much the user learns, or it's also relatively easy to kind of use an adaptive decoder and just kind of say that the performance gains come from the adapting of the decoder and not so much from the adaptation of the user. You can, try to contrive more clever and more complicated experiments to tease apart the sort of fine level at which these factors interplay.
And it is important to kind of understand these distinctions because it does change the way you would approach the problem. If you really thought that, the main benefit will come from the neurons adapting, then you would put your efforts into putting the user into the most optimal conditions for learning. And so maybe there's certain types of feedback that work best to get the neurons to adapt and that sort of thing. If you thought that it was kind of all on the back of the decoder to know exactly what the native use of these neurons was, and to figure that out, then you have to put a lot of effort into understanding the motor system as it is in a normal intact person who's just using their motor system to control their arm. And then if you think that the decoder needs to adapt to the neurons in whatever way that works, then you have to put effort into understanding decoders and how to optimize them and that sort of thing. So these aren't just kind of different opinions and that sort of thing. It doesn't matter kind of what the answer is or what you expect the answer to be as to what or to how you pursue this kind of research.
So can I ask you, Josh, do you know the answer to this? Can you give some sense of what brain-machine interfaces of interesting kinds can do?
Yes, so today I think there are a number of good labs that are doing things, but for example, Krishna Shenoy's group does some very nice work with cursor control, and at this point, using a couple of Utah arrays in a monkey, they're able to fairly robustly control a cursor in 2 dimensions on a computer screen and have that work nicely. They're moving to more complicated settings, but in terms of things that are kind of solved in a certain sense. Now, this is solved in monkey, and I think they're basically in the process of porting this to people. Robust cursor control that's kind of on par with the level of cursor control that you could get with a person using a mouse.
Okay. Krishna Shenoy is a professor at Stanford.
Yeah.
And so one issue there is, cursor control on a 2D screen, in terms of the dimensionality of the problem, it's basic, it's 2 dimensions. You have to control the vertical and horizontal positions of the cursor, which is obviously really simple compared to an arm. I don't know what's the dimensionality of an arm.
Yeah, so
8, right?
It depends on how you count. So technically, if you think of the human arm, you can kind of roughly approximate it as it's in the 20s in number of degrees of freedom. If you count every joint angle in each finger, the wrist and its kind of rotations and all of this, and the shoulder rotations and the elbow. If you count all of the kind of muscle flexions and degrees of freedoms there, it's kind of 25, 27, that kind of ballpark.
But obviously for actual applications, they simplify it usually to is the hand opened or closed.
Exactly. So you can do kind of dimensionality reduction where you look for joint angles in your hand and in your arm that are highly correlated. And so maybe it's unlikely that you're going to, and in fact, you can't totally move your ring finger independently of other fingers. So you could kind of break it down to a small number, kind of 5 to 8. By just saying the shoulder moves, the elbow moves, the wrist rotates, and there's open and closed of the hand, kind of modulo a few other things. And you can get kind of a lot of the resolution there.
So one point just is that Shenoy's thing that you say is basically a solved problem in monkeys currently being ported into humans.
For cursor control.
For cursor control is low dimensional and therefore in some sense easy, but from one point of view that's not very impressive because they haven't solved anything near the fully most difficult problems manipulating something very complicated like a hand
playing
plus
the
an
piano
arm,
or
playing the
something.
piano or whatever you
but
want to do.
But I have to imagine that when they first started this research, it was like a pretty dismal thing to just be able to control a cursor. But now that so much happens online, like if you can control a cursor, you
that's
can
what I was
do
going to
anything.
say. Like in terms of like actual benefit to patients,
that's
being
probably
able to
huge.
control a 2D cursor if you're completely
Tremendous
paralyzed
for
is
that.
like incredibly useful. So
And especially given the level of reliability. And I mean, the other thing you got to keep in mind, right, is that, again, this is a small number of neurons, right? I mean, they're recording from, generously, a couple hundred neurons. And with just that, you're able to do this, right? I mean, sure, we have dexterous control over our hands, but we do so with thousands, tens of thousands, millions of neurons. Yeah. So, I mean, there's many neurons that go into control of our body, and to just kind of almost randomly, with, some like pre-selection, right? But kind of approximately randomly select neurons from a certain brain region and only have a small set and be able to do like a really good job on cursor control. It's definitely not obvious that would have been possible. So it's like kind of tremendously cool that it is.
yeah.
And obviously there are labs who are actively working on getting actual physical movements returned to these patients through prosthetic limbs, but those are, not as far along in the research, and obviously it's a lot more difficult to do, but there was a video recently of a woman who could bring a cup of coffee to her lips with a prosthetic arm. There's also a famous video from Andy Schwartz's lab of a monkey who is grabbing marshmallows and feeding himself through a brain-computer interface using a prosthetic arm. So people are still obviously working very hard on that aspect of it, but if you can get a lot of functionality returned to a patient with just a cursor, then I think people are happy to pursue that route too.
Like an important issue, which I guess people don't draw a lot of attention to, maybe we don't know that much about it, is longevity in these studies. So I
think there are people who draw a lot of attention to that. It's just not the scientists.
But it's not,
it's an engineering thing.
It's an engineering problem.
Yeah, but it's not like the sexy thing that a scientist wants to report, right?
No,
but you could also imagine that it is a science problem because the neuron activity will be changing over time and all of that. So you need to find a sustainable solution.
There's kind of complexity to it. So, like, I mean, one issue is, I guess, kind of broadly speaking, that the immune system kind of attacks the electrode arrays.
Sure, yeah.
And so you kind of get scarring in those areas and things like this. And so there are material scientists, bioengineers, biomedical engineers.
So we should say the average span, like useful span of one of these arrays in a monkey is usually maybe a year or so, where you're getting clean signal.
I think they can sometimes last longer than that.
Yeah.
For slightly noisier signal. Mm-hmm. And I think it can be even a few years. So I think that this isn't like totally well understood in all cases. But yeah, I mean, so there's kind of a whole, I think, engineering endeavor to make the electrodes more robust, not deteriorate, and not cause these kinds of responses by the body that try to prevent them from working. But so that's kind of one thing. And a kind of almost separate issue is like maybe the neurons that you're recording from, maybe the electrode array gets jiggled and you get a different set of neurons the next day, or maybe you're recording from the same neurons but they've kind of changed their patterns for whatever reason. Kind of broadly, you can kind of hand wave and call this non-stationarity, just like, that the signals are changing over time. And that's like a problem that I think there actually are some good statistical solutions to. So there are a number of kind of approaches where people try to update, even without new training data, just try to update the decoder in light of minor non-stationarities. But that's obviously something that people still are working on. That is kind of a contemporary problem as well.
So do you imagine that if someone were to use one of these devices every day, they'd kind of have to like calibrate it every morning to their, whatever particular set of neurons it has going on? You have some sort of task where you show the decoder, okay, right now I'm trying to point to this exact spot, and so it kind of can get a little training.
So I think people were afraid that was going to have to be the case for a while. And recently, though, the last 5 years or so, I think there's been a number of papers that try to avoid this problem entirely with statistical solutions. Either kind of assuming that most of the neurons are doing similar things and only a small number change on relevant timescales. As long as that's the case, then you can basically update things quite nicely and not have your performance erode. And there are a few other kind of settings where people have come up with some statistical tricks to make this work out. So I think the hope now is that if you get things calibrated somehow at the beginning, get things working well, as long as things don't change dramatically,
too
quickly, then you can keep things working well. The hope is, and there's some demonstration that this works, that you can keep things working well enough.
For any individual, obviously, the first time they use it, there would have to be some learning. I think sometimes when people hear things like brain-computer interfaces, there's like a fear like, oh, someone can just plug something into my brain and they'll, be able to read my thoughts or something. But I think no matter how advanced the technology gets, there's always going to have to be some point where you kind of provide feedback to the system that's trying to read your neural activity.
If you don't know, actually I don't know a lot about this at all, Josh knows more. You can imagine that you might need to build like incredibly complicated algorithms in order to take the neural activity and in any way reliably predict what someone wants to do, which is obviously to some extent true, and that's like one major component of what BMI research is about. So maybe you can tell us a little bit about how complicated decoders need to be. Can you use kind of generic algorithms that have been imported from other fields?
Yeah, so there's innovation in adapting kind of generic statistical tools to this setting, and it's kind of like almost an engineering problem to take kind of generic things that could be used for like decoding in other statistical settings and applying them here. But mostly people who do kind of machine learning and Bayesian statistics have kind of a suite of tools, and people try quite simple things as baseline for decoding, and they also try sort of increasingly complex things. It's not clear what the optimal solutions will be kind of down the road, but there's been some evidence suggesting that you don't actually need very complicated methods, because when you actually put the animal in closed loop settings, you can use a relatively simple thing and it works reasonably well. And if you make things marginally more realistic, or kind of build better assumptions into your models, your decoding models, they don't actually end up working that much better in these closed loop settings when the animal's learning a bit and controlling things. So that's kind of one partial answer, right? That you could try simple things and increasingly complex things, and it's not even clear that if you do the kind of statistically more rigorous things, they always work better in the application settings. So that's not totally clear, but there's a bit of that. And then the other thing is and this is definitely quite useful, is if you know something about the structure of the movements you're trying to decode, you can do a much better job. And this is generally pretty clear, right? So you can basically, if you're trying to control a cursor just by constraining it to be like a smooth trajectory to some extent, or a trajectory that's not going to jump from one point to another point all the time, you'll do a better job.
This is kind of Bayesian thing, right?
Yeah.
You have prior knowledge about what things might happen in the world.
Yeah.
When someone's trying to move an arm, they're almost certainly not trying to wiggle it at high frequencies or something.
Exactly. And maybe the wrist is going to move much further than the shoulder rotation is not going to be that large in magnitude relative to the wrist movements and position out in space. As you're waving your arm around, the shoulder's not going to move that much. Certainly the shoulder position, and the elbow maybe doesn't bend that much except for in certain types of movements. And so you can kind of learn about like the structure of all of the joint angles in the arm, and you can use that kind of information to improve the quality of the decoder. But aside from that, it's not clear that you need much more than kind of approximately linear-ish relationships between the neurons and various variables you're trying to decode. But you just kind of leverage some of that prior information about the movement space.
Do you know what algorithms Chinoy's group use in their successful cursor control?
Yeah, it's basically a Kalman filter. So basically, kind of in crude language, they just assume that the neurons are linearly related to like position and velocity of the cursor, and that the cursor is going to not jump around on the screen. It's going to like from one kind of moment in time to the next is going to be pretty close to where it is. And put those two pieces of information together and you basically get things. And just to be clear, we know that the neurons aren't linearly related to those variables. I mean, there's obviously linear is kind of like a first order approximation to what those variables are, but we know that these neurons have slightly more complicated response properties, right? You can just forget all about all this information, which we know from the physiology, and you can still do a reasonably good job of decoding.
So that's kind of related to a larger issue that you can talk about, or like an idea you can talk about with brain-computer interface, which we've kind of hinted at, is this question of how relevant neuroscience knowledge is in the creation of brain-computer interfaces. Or you could ask it the other way, and like, do we learn anything about neuroscience and about brains and how they work from building brain-computer interfaces? And I feel like naively most people would say, yeah, of course, you're interacting with the brain, you're using neurons to control something. How do you not learn things about the brain in the process? But I think a lot of people who are in this field would think, or would even say that you don't actually have to understand, say, how the motor cortex encodes motion to build a brain-computer interface. And it's that answer is related to these things we've talked about, where really only the biomimetic approach, where you actually try to get the decoder to do what the body itself was doing naturally. That's kind of the only approach where you really explicitly need to understand what the brain is doing. And these other approaches where you throw in a decoder and have the neurons adapt to it, or you have a decoder that tries to catch up with the neurons, those approaches don't necessarily require a really clean understanding of how the brain works. So it really is a question as to how related brain-computer interface development is to neuroscience.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is kind of a more general question as well, right? So, like, in most kind of clinical research, which kind of broadly is like research focused on kind of medical advancement, generically defined, right? It's not clear how much real science needs to get done to make these kind of clinical advancements, right? So, like, when people want to test a drug, it's often not the case that they do what scientists would consider, like, real, pure science to figure out how that drug works and what its effects are. You just kind of throw your drug at the animals and see what happens. I mean, that's a slight hyperbole. But
yeah, it's like pretty exploratory, basically. It's kind of you just kind of trial and error, fancy trial and error, sort of.
Large-scale trial.
Large-scale, well-funded.
Expensive trial.
Very expensive trial and error.
And so if you have...
With a lot of animals.
Yeah, exactly.
And humans.
And humans, yeah. So if you have this idea where, like, you think some drug might work, you try it and see what happens. And I think something kind of similar here occurs because, it's kind of a clinical thing. You're more interested in doing something that works well enough than you are in figuring out how the whole brain works in order to enable this technology. And, you can kind of debate about the issues around this philosophically, and I don't actually want to take a side strongly. I mean, I think for most neuroscientists, it seems intuitive that the more you know about the brain, in the long run, that should help with with many clinical problems, including brain-computer interface.
I think for biologists, it also, just relatedly, speaking of drugs, right? If you actually think about how drugs work, most of them are shit and have all kinds of weird side effects, and we don't know why. And they don't really do what we want them to do exactly. And that's all. I assume that is in large part related to the fact that we don't understand the biology that's relevant in almost any case. So we don't design drugs in like principled ways based on understanding, this is exactly how this kind of pain works, and this is precisely what we need to alter in the body in order to alleviate that pain.
Because we don't know the body well.
We don't know the body. We don't understand the body.
So if you just heard at some point, oh, I've heard that this drug has this effect in mice, someone stumbled upon that, then you think, all right, that's an effect I want. That made that mouse, seem to report less pain in painful circumstances. Well, then let's explore it. I think it's due to a sense of urgency that there isn't this this ethic of, wait, we need to figure out the exact mechanisms before we move on. It's just, no, it's working. We got to keep trying this so that we can have something that works. And that's obviously reasonable. And
yeah, because these things go in, theoretically these things proceed hand in hand, right? In parallel.
Yeah.
People kind of push, given current knowledge, what's the best we can do with whatever understanding we have. And then, in theory, in parallel, kind of more academic scientists, but also research scientists, maybe in industry, are at the same time pursuing better actual, detailed knowledge such that we can then build, next generation better drugs or brain-machine interface.
If anything, I do think that maybe the pure scientists resent slightly the extent to which the purely clinical research is funded often much better than the sort of basic research, which apparently should yield more interesting and more successful results, right? In theory, if the academic scientists can solve problems or understand how the brain works or how certain specific systems work, you would expect that you could really make strides in medical technology.
Yeah, but, so that's an important real world issue. It's very nice to say that in reality we develop drugs based on what we know now and we try to improve our understanding, but if
we spend most of our money.
Yeah, exactly. The practical issue of where do you spend the money is a choice that gets made somehow by a society or whatever. And I think, like you said, a lot of scientists probably feel like we didn't, choice has been
it's a
poorly
unbalanced.
Yeah, and so just kind of for the lay of the land, I think it's our perception at least that most people in biomedical research are more clinical than pure.
Yes.
Yeah.
And more of the money goes to them.
Yeah.
And
I think BCI is a good example of that because the Defense Department funds a lot of research on BCI for the purpose of helping people who are returning from war and have lost limbs and that sort of thing. So for this very issue, a lot of the money comes in through a clinical route. But there are people who think that BCI research is actually informative for neuroscience, people who work on it. So it's not that everyone feels that, I don't have to keep up with neuroscience, I do BCI work. So there's this paper from Miguel Nicolelis, who is a researcher at Duke University. It's from 2009, and it basically kind of addresses this issue. And from his viewpoint, there are many notions in neuroscience that research in brain-computer interface has kind of supported or helped further and that sort of thing. And so he's on the side that this research into interfacing with the brain is giving us information about how populations of neurons encode information.
I mean, just before we step into some of those details, I mean, to me, it's also, BCI is at least potentially appealing for kind of future research because there's not that much ability right now for researchers in neuroscience to record in detail from the human brain, right? There's in some rare cases, there are people who have who need surgery to treat their epilepsy, and we put invasive ECOG or micro ECOG in their brain for short periods of time, and sometimes you get an experiment slipped in there while they're in the hospital and they volunteer for it.
Epilepsy and a few other things.
Sure. But there aren't that many settings right now where we actually get to record from the human brain invasively, and with invasive recording giving us a lot more information, things like fMRI or EEG. Not that they give us information, but there are certain things that we really need invasive techniques for. And BCI, in principle, it's going to help people, and once the electrodes are in their brain, there's definitely the opportunity to potentially, learn a lot about healthy brain function or the brain function of these people who have them implanted chronically.
Yeah, and maybe again, just one more thing before we get into some of the details from this paper by Nicolelis. I mean, it is clear that we have learned things, right? I mean, you said earlier on that it wasn't at all obvious some time ago that you'd be able to, with a basically random sampling of neurons in some part of the brain, and then with a basically not very complicated decoder, control anything. And now there are at least some cases where we can do that really well. And that does tell you something quite crude, but I mean, it tells you something about some of the basic kind of parameters of how the brain works. Ballpark, with this many neurons, you can do these things, and you don't need some very specific readout of the information in the neural activity to make certain things happen, which tells you things that we, are not very detailed maybe, but they are things we didn't know.
Sure.
So, getting to this, I mean, this paper is kind of framed around the presentation of some principles of neural ensemble physiology that it's argued are kind of learned from brain-computer interface science, or at least bolstered. So, are there any that kind of strike you as particularly?
Well, they're the first. So maybe the first 3 or 4. So I'll list the titles he gives to these. There's a distributed coding principle, a single neuron insufficiency principle, a multitasking principle, and a mass effect principle. And he frames these as all having slightly different focuses, but the general idea is that you need a population of cells to do anything interesting. So the notion that there's distributed coding, it's just that you're not going to find one single area or one single neuron that's going to give you sufficient information to tell you what the arm is supposed to be doing. You're going to need to look at multiple neurons, and an effect of that is that these neurons are usually multitasking, meaning that each neuron is providing information about many different things, maybe the position and velocity of the arm or different parameters about muscles and that sort of thing.
So these are logically distinct points, right? It could be the case that there's only redundancy, but each neuron encodes like a specific thing, and that there are multiple neurons that encode that specific thing. But I think most contemporary neuroscientists, or certainly computational neuroscientists, kind of associate these things together, that when you have a population that's representing something or encoding something or related to something, that the signals often get mixed.
Yeah.
And this is kind of a new way of thinking about things, but something that I think most... Yeah.
In neuroscience, I mean, it's kind of... I think in some ways, if you were an alien who landed on Earth and had decided to put neural recording devices in the brains of humans and try to predict their behavior from what their brains were doing, it seems to me that... maybe we can argue about this, but it seems to me that some of these principles should kind of be the null hypothesis. Maybe I have a very skewed perception of it. Like, I feel like it would be really surprising if you put a thing in and it was like, oh, actually, it turns out that every single neuron encodes one specific parameter of all behavior, and that no two neurons, encode the same thing.
But you don't have to have a thought experiment about aliens. You can look at what humans actually did, and at least for sensory systems, they kind of did think, you can look at an individual neuron and you can see what it corresponds to in terms of input stimuli. And so if that's the history that
so it was the case historically in neuroscience that people recorded from animals and kind of expected or speculated that they would be able to verbally and intuitively describe simple variables that a specific individual neuron corresponded to.
And that was...
represented, encoded, whatever.
And that was possible in a bunch of cases. But it seems really obvious to me that that's what happened because it's just the easiest thing.
We looked at the simplest areas like primary visual cortex.
And it's not... And also it's just too complicated. What you do is you give some very simple stimulus and you just are trying to find neurons that are correlated in a direct way with some parameter of the thing that you're changing. So you move something and you're just looking for neurons that fire when you move it. So it was almost like, it seems very built in a way. So I guess the alien thing, I was thinking of some kind of, I could have just said if humans had been like smarter and less...
Yeah, that sounds like a pretty intelligent alien species you came up with. Like, they come to Earth, they already know that our brains are what control us. Like, that took humans forever. We were poking around at our hearts for a long time.
God, so supposed to.
Yeah. But yeah, so clearly it's not the case that BCI research alone is what led us to the notion that, hey, you have to look at a bunch of neurons and each neuron might be doing many different things, and also the neurons are noisy, so you have to, collect many of them at one time to get an average of the activity because you can't trust any individual neuron. These kinds of things obviously show up basically anywhere in the brain. But there's, I think it's somewhat reasonable to say that BCI work has helped solidify some of these notions, or certainly offered more evidence that these ideas are what are at play in controlling behavior.
And maybe it's particularly relevant in BCI in a certain sense.
Because you need to actually decide how many neurons am I going to record from, and what should I be expecting them to be encoding and that kind of thing.
This is a good example of how science and kind of engineering interact, and also it gets at what science is and the purpose of science in a way. I think pretty much all of these principles were kind of things that people knew before people tried to do BCI, or around the same time or something. Or a lot of these ideas are more solidly accepted now, but they're not. I don't think it's fair to claim that any of these principles was to whatever extent they're even true, any of them was a discovery of the field of brain-machine interfacing or something. But it's definitely the case that when you try to make very precise your claims about a system and in particular try to kind of control and manipulate it, which effectively is brain-machine interfacing is something like that. You're trying to really measure the brain's activity in a precise enough way that you can actually like make it have predictable effects on the world. And so in that sense, it kind of, like you said, it basically solidifies, it makes very concrete the ways in which some of these things are kind of relevant.
So another way of looking at that, I think, is just that kind of at an even higher level. I mean, so as kind of computational theoretical scientists, it's interesting to make models that make predictions. Then you can kind of validate those models on new data, and it can tell you interesting things. You can kind of formalize your hypotheses about what you think is going on. Brain-computer interface research is in some way like a natural test bed to say how well can we do things with neurons. Again, we've already kind of talked about the fact that it's not clear that you need to know that much about the brain to pull this off.
Yeah.
But if you do think you know something about the brain, something like a BCI for that system is a reasonable way of validating if that's like real at all, if it has any measurable effects.
Yeah.
It seems clear that you would want to. So this article by Nicholas is kind of trying to answer what is normally the reverse question of what has BCI told us about neuroscience. But since people are kind of questioning whether BCI is even informed by neuroscience, I mean, I think it just obviously is, because, or at least if you're doing good work, you should pay attention to neuroscience, because if we're going to say, I believe this is true about neurons in the motor system, and, if that were true, it could make you have a better BCI, like, you want to take that information into account. Or just learning about plasticity generally, now that we realize how important that is for BCI. Any research on how neurons change and adapt to feedback should be very relevant to people who are interested in building good BCIs.
I think the point about how BCIs can be a test bed for ideas that you have in neuroscience, an interesting kind of distinction to make is that, you build a BCI, and the idea would be, say, if you think you know something about how motor cortex works, you should be able to build good or better BCIs or something.
That's not totally clear.
Well, that's, if you knew exactly how it works,
and
you could record all the neurons or
if
something.
you have the appropriate technology, it should be true.
Then you should be able to do anything. I mean, but an interesting thing is that that's kind of never going to be a full test of a theory of the brain in a sense, because you should also be able to manipulate more directly, right? So you should be able to do the opposite thing, which would be, if you could control neural activity, you should be able to produce behavior.
Sure.
Yes, which is a different.
So maybe there's something to be said for sensory prostheses as perhaps more useful as for testing things, because you can write in. But yeah, I mean, generally scientists do use decoding in generic settings as a measure that they understand the system. So
yeah, but I think, as Connor kind of alluded to before, the fact that you can, get a BCI to work really well, that doesn't necessarily mean that you can then explain how the system works naturally to someone.
Sure.
And obviously for scientists, that's the goal, is to be able to explain how the system actually works. And scientists kind of view the creation of something like a BCI as verification that your explanation was correct. So the fact that you can have the verification without the explanation, in a way, it's just not completely
sometimes unsatisfying.
Yeah.
We've talked a lot about BCI and we've related it to some of the science. I mean, one thing that's interesting to me is how much emphasis is placed on the notion of having a satisfying explanation. So I think that'll probably be a recurring theme in things that we talk about across topics.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, there's an emphasis here on understanding what the system really does. And it's a very complicated system, clearly. So what's the point of having like a intellectually satisfying explanation? And I think a certain kind of thinker, a certain kind of academic, kind of usually more likely to be found in engineering or in clinical science, would just say the satisfying part is if you can get it to do what you want it to do. So the test that you understand the motor cortex as much as you need to is that you have an adequate brain-computer interface. And this is definitely not the way that like people trained in physics or some people trained in biology would think. They really want there to be something that they can write in a textbook and have as kind of a distilled parcel of information that they can refer to, and it is whatever it means to be intellectually satisfying.
I'm inclined to think, though, that if you really did build a BCI that is just functioning amazingly well, that either it's because there's been enough, like, science in the air around you that you actually do understand the system, or someone understands the system well enough, or if you just kind of looked under the hood for like a minute, you get insights as to how the system works. If you did some sort of, completely automated optimization system that determined what your decoders would be and how they would learn and all that kind of stuff, and like you didn't really think about it, but then you found something that worked really well, if you just poked at how that thing worked and kind of got some properties of it, you'd probably understand the way the biological system works.
Sure, but like kind of the toy extreme case, the extreme corner is like, we make an AI and it tells us what the best BCI is.
Yeah,
but it's a black box to us.
Sure,
right?
I mean, but that's what I mean. Like,
yeah.
It can be a black box, but it would take minimal effort to make it not
or
a black
maybe
box, I imagine, once it's working.
Okay. Maybe the AI has to understand it or something. Like, is there a philosophical thing where
someone has to understand
in order for
something
like
to be
something to work, something has to understand it.
I mean, it works. Our brains work, and
no one
nothing understands it. Evolution, we assume, kind of randomly produced this. So I don't think there's a philosophical.
Maybe evolution understomes it or something.
Whatever that means.
You just made an airtight argument for God right there.
Yeah, God exists. Good. We can also imagine kind of like cool science fiction-y awesome things that we can do with brain-machine interfaces. Like, I think this is kind of cool. Nicolaitis mentions it in his paper, which is like, you could have actuators that exist on completely different scales to the human body. For example, like little nano machines. And so you can imagine like controlling those with a brain-machine interface where you would have some kind of feedback on some tiny scale, and you could like control little tiny surgical robots with your mind and do amazingly precise things. Or you could control like huge things, like satellites and stuff. I don't know.
I've always wanted the weather to match my mood. So if I could get something in my amygdala that controls like
your local
clouds
weather
and stuff, that's when we've really solved it in my mind.
I think controlling
and solved meteorology.
Yeah, we have to solve meteorology. It's going to be hard.
But then there's another kind as well that like a certain school endorses. Mm. I like to think of it kind of as like the Dr. Octopus kind of brain-computer interface, which is like almost cyborg kind of thing. It's where the
extending.
But it's also where the this can be used for rehabilitative purposes as well, right? But the idea is that the BCI thing is partly autonomous. You give it some signal, but it's like part robot, and your signals kind of give it a high level objective.
Yeah.
So like. Yeah,
climb me up that mountain.
Yeah, and then like, or you're in your wheelchair and you like think where you want to go, and the wheelchair figures out what the best path is to get you there. Or similarly, if like reaching and grasping with an arm. So there's all these. If we're extremely optimistic, there's all these very cool.
The future is bright.
The future is bright, but for the time being, I think there's already some cool stuff.
All right.
Anything else?
I think that's all. Till next time.